actual nightmare family. The idea of taking his family sailing on the emerald waters of the tropics had long been Arthur Duperrault's fantasy. The ophthalmologist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, remembered sailing on the warmer waters to the far south during World War II as he stared out over the frigid blue waters of Lake Michigan. He frequently mentioned his desire to spend a year sailing between islands and living on a yacht. Duperrault had achieved enough popularity by 1961 to, at least partially, realize his objective. He would travel to the Bahamas that year instead of enduring a harsh Wisconsin winter with his wife Jean, son Brian, 14, and daughters Terry Jo, 11, and Renee, 7. On a rented yacht, they intended to spend a week getting a taste of life at sea before deciding whether or not to extend their sabbatical. When they got to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, they rented a two-masted sailboat called the Bluebell and appointed Julian Harvey, a former Air Force fighter pilot and seasoned sailor, as the ship's captain. Dean, Harvey's wife, would travel on the trip with the group. The Duperraults boarded the Bluebell early on Wednesday, November 8, 1961. To start their long-awaited journey, Captain Harvey maneuvered the boat away from the dock as the 115-horsepower Chrysler engine of the ship rumbled softly, wisps of exhaust sputtering from the stern. The Bluebell appeared to fly as she smoothly glided from the harbor's dark waters into the open sea's greenery, and then into the deep blue of the Gulf Stream, the massive sea current that runs between Florida and the Bahamas. The 700 islands of the Bahamas archipelago glistened in the 100,000 square miles of sun-drenched seas above them, holding out the hope that Duperrault's dream of a family trip might come true. Harvey steered the Bluebell east over the course of the following 4 days, first into the little island chain of Bimini and then further east to Sandy Point, a community on the southwest coast of Great Abaco Island. On the white and pink beaches, the party spent the entire week shell collecting and snorkeling. Duperrault and the Harveys visited Sandy Point Village Commissioner Roderick W. Pinder's office early on Sunday to complete documents needed to depart the Bahamas and return to the United States. Duperrault told Pinder this was a trip of a lifetime. We promised to return before Christmas. Dean made a salad and chicken caxiator for dinner that night. The lunch was going to be the last ever prepared on the Bluebell. Terry Jo went to her sleeping accommodations in a little cabin at the back of the boat around 9 o'clock. Renee usually slept there as well, but on this particular night, her younger sister slept with her parents and brother in the cockpit on deck. Terry Jo was awakened in the middle of the night by her brother screaming, "Help, Daddy, help." Also, she briefly heard running and stamping noises. Then a pause. She was trembling, lost in thought, and afraid as she laid in bed. Terry Jo sneaked out of her cabin after around 5 minutes. In the main cabin, which served as a kitchen and dining area during the day and a bedroom at night, she discovered her mother and brother lying crumpled in a pool of blood. She realized they were gone right away. Terry Jo ascended the stairs gradually and poked her head through the hatch. She noticed more blood puddles and perhaps a knife on the starboard side of the cockpit. She ascended the deck and faced the front of the vessel. She was suddenly shoved down the stairs by Captain Harvey, who suddenly pounced at her. He growled, "Go back down there." With her heart racing, Terry Jo went back to her bedroom and slipped back onto her bunk, trying to keep her eyes away from the remains of her mother and brother. Sloshing was then audible. Shortly, the floor of her cabin was covered with water that had an oily odor. While Terry Jo could see that the ship was accumulating water, she was too terrified to move. She abruptly noticed the outline of the captain's dark figure in the cabin doorway. He stood looking down at her while holding something in his hands, possibly her brother's weapon. His labored breathing, the beating of her heart in her ears, and the smack of the rising water on the bulkheads were the only sounds in the space. She heard the captain turn around and leave the cabin as he ascended the stairs back to the upper deck. Terry Jo realized she had to leave the cottage when water began to seep over the top of her mattress. She returned to the summit after wading through waist-deep water to reach the stairs. Terry Jo could see the ship's dinghy and rubber life raft floating alongside the boat on the port side thanks to a bulb above the main mast of the vessel. She yelled, "Is the ship sinking?" "Yes." As he approached her from behind, Harvey yelled. He slipped the dinghy line into her hands. "Hold this," he exclaimed. Terry Jo let the line slide through her fingers because she was so startled. The dinghy gently sailed away from the Bluebell as she sank. To get it, Harvey leaped overboard. As he vanished into the night, Terry Jo watched him swim after the dinghy. The main cabin, which was now just barely above the water, was constantly tethered to the top right side. She recalled the cork-life float that was stored there. She immediately unfastened the small, oblong float after scurrying to it. The boat deck submerged into the water beneath her feet as the float broke loose. She moved the float into the open water while somewhat crawling and partially swimming. One of the float's lines tangled with the sinking ship as she got aboard it. As the Blueboat descended, Terry Joe and the float were briefly dragged underwater. The float with Terry Joe on it then popped back up to the surface as the line eventually broke loose. Fearing that the captain may be waiting for her in the murky waters, she hunkered low on the float. She lacked food, water, and anything to keep her warm during the chilly night in addition to her thin white top and pink leggings. She was unable to see the stars because of the moon setting in the thick clouds. Although she could hear the wind howling, she was blind. Unexpected waves broke, stinging her in the eyes and lips with salt water. She was suddenly drenched by a shower and started to tremble violently. Eventually, she was only thinking about one thing: where's my father? The sun warmed Terry Joe's delicate body the following morning, a Monday, but she immediately recognized it would bring a greater threat. The temperature quickly climbed to 85 degrees as the day went on, and the sun started to burn her. Her legs and feet were now exposed to the parrotfish's razor-sharp jaws as the fragile float started to break apart. Her throat became more parched and her tongue drier as the hours went by. She wasn't hungry, and she wasn't thirsty either. A little red plane made a circling past Tuesday. She stood there for a while, waving her blouse in its direction. It even dove once in her way. She waved passionately as hope filled her heart. She could see the features of the plane's underside as it went directly over her, but the angle at which it was flying prevented the pilots from being able to see her. It was unlikely that Terry Joe would be spotted by anyone on a passing ship or aircraft. Her blonde hair, white blouse, and float made her appear to be one of many whitecaps crashing over the ocean's blue surface. She was in the Northwest Providence Channel, which would soon be carried across the vast Atlantic to the British Isles by the Gulf Stream as it moved north, and then east. Early that day, Terry Joe noticed spectral figures just below the water's surface, around 30 yards away from her float. Her chest tightened as she swallowed. When the shapes drew nearer, she realized they were porpoises. They fixed her with their big, black eyes. The whooshing noises the animals produced as they surfaced to breathe calmed Terry Joe in an unexpected way. She gave thanks to God for sending them in a brief prayer. They stayed nearby for several hours. In the late afternoon, as the piercing sun peeked through the clouds, Terry Joe sprayed some water on her taut, burnt skin. The frigid waters of Green Bay and Wisconsin's cool woodlands felt so far away. Finally, the sun dipped below the horizon. Tuesday night provided her body blessed reprieve, but it also brought back the terrifying uncertainty in the darkness. She had a vivid dream that she was in the cockpit of an airplane coming in for a landing while the float rose and fell on the waves that third chilly night. She noticed the iridescent landing lights' long, straight, convergent lines standing out with surreal brilliance against a bottomless, flowing blackness. She had a dream in which she saw her father enjoying a glass of red wine while sitting calmly. Wine looked energizing and was exactly what she needed to cure her thirst, despite the fact that she had never tasted it. She then heard him yell, "Come on, Terry Joe," to her. "We're going out." Wednesday began clear and sunny, and it quickly heated up. Her dry eyes were in excruciating pain from the sun's intensity. Her muscles all hurt. Her slacks and blouse both burned into her skin. Her lips were puffy and cracked because so much of the float's rope webbing had broken off. Terry Joe was forced to balance much of the time rigidly on its edges. She started to have more hallucinations at this point, visualizing a small desert island with a single palm tree. She made an attempt to paddle toward it, but it vanished. She eventually lost consciousness. She was not aware of the merciless sun's scorching rays when it rose on Thursday. She was on the verge of passing away while in a deep sleep. She was repeatedly attacked by water walls. Lifted to the summits of sheer cliffs, her raft was then lowered into shadowy valleys. Now, only the tiniest ember of life flickered, but she awoke from her trance in the middle of the fourth day alone on the raft. Before her, a large shadow loomed like a formidable beast. She could feel the rhythmic hammering of its rumble in her chest due to how deep it was. It appeared to change as she observed, first into an otherworldly vessel hovering above the water, then into a massive whale, and last into a solid black wall suspended in the air above her. She noticed heads and waving arms when she raised her gaze to the top of that massive wall. She could just make out shouting voices. Finally, she experienced being lifted into the air. She was carefully raised by strong arms as she sank back into unconsciousness. There wasn't much information available regarding Julian Harvey's past at the time he was hired as the skipper of the Bluebell. The 44-year-old was married to Mary Dean Jordan, an aspiring writer and former TWA flight attendant. He was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel. The lookout on an oil tanker headed for Puerto Rico saw a little wooden dinghy adrift in the middle of the wide and deep northwest Providence Channel the day after the Bluebell went down. "My name is Julian Harvey," a guy shouted from the dinghy as the captain drew the tanker closer. "I am the Bluebell's master." Harvey informed the Miami-based Coast Guard in the days that followed that he was the only survivor of a serious disaster. He said that in the middle of the previous night, a strong squall wrecked the sailboat. The Duperraults and his wife Dean were hurt when the masts and rigging gave way. The engine room's gas lines burst, causing the ship to catch fire as it slowly sank. Harvey claimed that he had been able to launch the raft and dinghy and dive overboard, but that the tangled rope had imprisoned everyone else. Harvey learned that Terry Jo had survived a few days later while he was working at the Sandman Hotel. A hotel maid discovered blood on the bed sheets in Harvey's room the following morning. Her manager contacted the police after she was unable to open the bathroom door. They pried through the door and discovered Harvey's lifeless, bleeding body on the floor. He had committed suicide. Terry Jo was transported by helicopter to a hospital in Miami after being rescued from the water by a crew member of the Greek freighter Captain Theo. Officials questioned Terry Jo in her hospital bed a week after her rescue. Her testimony, as it is presented here, contradicts Harvey's version of what happened. Together with Dean Harvey, her father, mother, brother, and younger sister had all been killed on board the Bluebell by Julian Harvey. One explanation holds that Duperrault discovered Harvey in the act, which led to the other deaths. The police assumed that Harvey killed his wife in order to collect money from her life insurance. In order to live with her father's sister and 3 cousins, Terry Jo moved back to Green Bay. She changed her name to Tyr when she was 12. In a loan, Tyr eventually disclosed the specifics of the evening her family was slaughtered and her days spent drifting in open ocean nearly 50 years later. In 2010, on the ocean alone, Tyr told CBS News, "I always believed I was preserved for a reason. My journey will have been worthwhile if it helps just one person recover from a life tragedy." If you enjoyed tonight's virtual nightmare, I hope the like and subscribe button haunt you tonight. Also, turn on all notifications to avoid being haunting. If you want to share your own virtual nightmare story, submit via Reddit or Instagram. Links will be in the description.